75 years ago, the most bloody and brutal war in the history of the world came to an end. The deadliest military conflict in history began with the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party in 1933, which turned democratic Germany into a totalitarian country. Obsessed with Hitler's concept of a master Aryan race, the Nazis used the racially biased eugenics movement to justify the murdering of millions of Jews, Slavs, and other minority groups to make room for the German nation. A veil of evil descended upon Europe. When it appeared that all hope was lost, two competing powers with completely different worldviews formed a global coalition to give hope to millions of people to be able to survive the Nazi onslaught.
Near Washington, a giant Soviet bomber stands poised for flight. Her passenger, Soviet Commissar Molotov.
Moscow and Washington transcended political and ideological differences because the survival of the world depended on it. On the battleground, things were much simpler. Soviet and American soldiers saw the humanity in one another, working together to defeat Nazi Germany and bring balance to the world through a long-lasting peace. We'll try to tell this incredible story of cooperation between Russians and Americans through the testimonies of those who survived World War II and were fortunate enough to celebrate life because of the combined effort of Allied nations. What was started as a traditional war for European dominance very soon revealed its true nature. War of annihilation. All efforts of the European powers to turn revanchist energy of the Nazi Germany to the east fails. The surrender of Czechoslovakia and Poland failed to dampen Hitler's territorial ambitions, and Europe has fallen. The Nazi Party to free the land of Untermenschen people considered racially or socially inferior started immediately after the Nazis took power in 1933. But Europe, at that time, considered this racist policy to be a matter of German inner affairs.
Well, that's when Nazis came to power, and we used to see all anti-Semitic signs all over the city right away that the Jews are our misfortune. They are to blame for everything, and they had it on every street corner and banners, and so they prepared the public for what's going to come. They said, you know, the Jews are to blame for your misfortune here, but we have right now unemployment, no work, while they are rich. But I was too young to take it in. You know, I didn't realize what was going on there, but there was a change.
As soon as the Nazis crossed the German border, it became obvious that they had more ambitious plans. Not only did Jews and Romanis become the subject of Nazi extermination policies, but the Slavs and other nationalities immediately became victims of statewide repressions. During the early summer of 1941, the German war machine turned eastward. The advance was fierce and fast. But from the very beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis met strong opposition. Despite the Red Army's efforts, the Nazis managed to get to Russia's heart, Moscow. Soviet troops experienced devastating losses, but the destruction of military material was much more substantial. Battle of Moscow was most intense, the Allies came to help. Leaders of the United States and Great Britain decided to provide as much help as possible to the Soviet Union while settling the Atlantic Charter. At the end of August 1941, the first caravan loaded with war materials, named Dervish, arrived at the port of Arkhangelsk. On October 1st, 1941, the Soviet Union was added to the Act to Promote the Defense of the United States, which was established on March 11th, 1941. During the first 6 months, Great Britain provided the much-needed supplies to the Soviets, with American help following shortly thereafter. Tanks and aeroplanes, food and explosives, radios and cars. Americans provided these goods, which were in great demand at the Eastern Front. The Soviets expected a larger aid package from the Americans, but on December 7th, 1941, Japan made its surprise attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. In a single day, 2/3 of the American naval forces stationed in the Pacific were taken out of the game. Within 3 months, Allies lost most of their bases and struggled to keep Japanese forces away from Australia. Without a doubt, the American fight with Japan helped Russia. With Japan now occupied fighting the US, the Soviet High Command could now move its troops and equipment from the country's far east to the west of its country to boost the Moscow counteroffensive operation, the first operation of that scale against German forces. After the defeat of German forces on the approach to Moscow, the year 1942 was marked by combined Allied efforts to stop and revert territorial gains of the Axis powers.
From the sky, American and RAF bombers blast the enemy across a 40-mile front, unleashing tons of high explosive on Rommel's surprised and reeling Afrika Korps.
El Alamein, Midway, and finally Stalingrad put an end to the Axis advance. During this time, the American and the British aid to Russia grew significantly, and so did the spirit of common purpose.
The toll, 18 Japanese ships, cruisers, carriers, and destroyers, crippled like this or sent to the bottom. A blow more than equal to the defeat Japan suffered in the Battle of the Coral Sea.
1943 became the turning point in the battle against the Nazis. The Battle of Kursk broke the spine of the German forces in the east, while Allied victories in North Africa and Sicily cut off the Nazi tentacles in the west.
He tells how 3,000 planes and motors, some 4,000 tanks, have been shipped to the Soviet Union over the northern route alone.
At the same time, Lend-Lease deliveries poured into the Soviet Union on a much larger scale, playing a vital role in keeping the Allied war machine operating, especially in the months preceding the US entry into the war. There were 3 main delivery routes used to deliver goods to the Soviets: Arctic convoys from Britain to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the Persian Corridor by land through Iran, and the Pacific route by sea and air by American forces to the Soviet Far East. In total, during those 4 years, Americans provided millions of tons of equipment needed to sustain the Soviet Union in its struggle against the Nazis. 22,150 airplanes, 12,700 tanks and armored vehicles, 375,833 trucks and cars, 472 million ammunition, 2.1 million tons of oil fuel, including high-octane gasoline for the airplanes. It was less known, but there was a reversed Lend-Lease program where Moscow paid off some of its debt by offering aid to American troops stationed abroad. While ordering explosives and artillery powder from its American ally, the USSR provided formulae and technology used in a famous Katyusha multiple rocket launcher to the United States, which helped the Soviets' war ally spearhead the development and production of American rockets, later widely used by the US Navy and Air Force. The Axis war effort may have failed, but this did not halt their policies of racial hatred. Cornered by the Allied advances on all fronts, the Nazis became more ruthless, embarking on an inhumane state program of brutal extermination called the Final Solution.
We either came over a small crest or out of a wooded area, and there in front of us, like from one horizon to the other, was this barbed wire city. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. And as we came up to it, I remember seeing one chain link fence, then a distance and another chain link fence. I remember seeing the gray or white porcelain insulators that held electrified barbed wire along the tops. We saw several people inside the camp. And as we turned the corner, we came eventually to the gates. And what struck me strange, I knew no German, but from Yiddish I gathered there were letters about this high, made out of metal, across the two gates. And it said, Jedem das Seine.
Almost all European Jews, as well as millions of Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, and peoples of many other nationalities, were moved to Nazi labor and death camps. The former differs from the latter only by the rate of extermination. And let's not forget that hundreds of thousands of innocent lives were lost on the spot in extrajudicial killings even before the Nazis had a chance to round them up and send them to camps. Victims of Nazi terror turned their hopes to an Allied advance as a chance of salvation, and it came soon, but not nearly soon enough.
And we all just sat there in front of these gates. I say in front of the gates, maybe 25, 35 yards from the gates. We just sat there in our vehicles, looking. And finally somebody said, and I remember it clearly, what the hell are we waiting for? So we all climbed out and we went in. Every so often, there were 1 or 2 or 3 dead bodies on the ground. The buildings were within 20 yards, 25 yards from us. Alongside some of the buildings were large wooden wagons with bodies, naked bodies, stacked like cordwood where they were thrown. Arms, legs, skeletal heads.
The launch of Operation Overlord in June 1944 on the beaches of Normandy by British-American forces and coordinated efforts by the Soviets to set in motion Operation Bagration in the east gave millions of people in Europe a chance to survive. Victory after victory followed, and defeat of Nazi Germany seemed within reach. One by one, the Soviets, British, and the American forces began liberating the Nazi concentration and labor camp system as the Allies edged closer to total victory.
He said that if it wasn't for us coming in, or the camp being liberated and the nurses coming in taken care of the people there, he said within another 2 weeks, everybody would have been gone at Dachau. He said he was in one of the boxcars, one of the few people remembering a soldier coming over and lifting him out of the boxcar. And he said, remembered the kind hands of the nurses taking care of him.
And finally, Russians and Americans met at the shores of the Elbe River on April the 25th, 1945. While they fought separately for 4 long years, they fought together in the name of humanity, as the Americans and Soviet soldiers celebrated life, the triumph of humanity over racism, and ultimately the imminent unconditional surrender of all German forces in another highly symbolic event 6,000 miles away. Representatives of 50 governments met in San Francisco for a conference which launched the drafting of the United Nations Charter to preserve world peace. That peace, coined from the ashes of World War II, is still alive today, thanks to the sacrifice of the Allied forces.
The world has experienced a revival of an old faith in the everlasting moral force of justice. Nothing is more essential to the future peace of the world than continued cooperation of the nations, which had to muster the force necessary to defeat the conspiracy of which the Axis powers to dominate the world, with firm faith in our hearts to sustain us along the hard road to victory. We will find our way to secure peace for the ultimate benefit of all humanity. We must build a new world, a far better world, one in which the eternal dignity of man is respected. If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.